a lot of guidance, but at the same time kind of go out, find some answers, pull together a project that is presented well persuasively, that makes some real progress on something in the real world. So I just want to acknowledge how much really, really hard work went to these projects. And that's that. Also, we have 3 handouts. Please give feedback. We pass these directly back to the group so that they can adopt that as part of their final written projects. So without further ado, are you guys choose? Okay.
Okay, hi everyone, thanks for coming. And my Capstone group will start things off. I have been working for the last 3 years with a coalition of 7 different countries in the Western Indian Ocean. And if you don't know where that is, you will very soon. And the students of my Capstone were helping to develop a conservation finance strategy that will support marine and near coastal conservation initiatives in those 7 countries. And if that doesn't make any sense to you, it will in a couple of minutes. So take it away.
So the goal of our capstone was to research potential financial solutions to conservation issues in the Western Indian Ocean, and subsequently to craft a comprehensive financial plan to fund responsible and sustainable efforts in this region. The 3 areas that were necessary in organizing a conservation finance-based structure were sustainable banking, researched by Catherine, Alyssa, and Tommy, which was responsible for getting investors and funds. Conservation finance tools, researched by myself, Leah, Chris, Jake, and Annabelle, and we considered where and how best to implement the funds that were given to us. And finally, measures of success sought by Emma, Alex, and Nicole devised recommendations for implementing and achieving a sustainable business model.
The region of the Western Indian Ocean that we focused on is comprised of the countries Kenya, Tanzania, Mozambique, Madagascar, Comoros, Mauritius, the Seychelles, and the French territories, Réunion and Mayotte. Over 60 million coastal residents live in this region, and these nations rely on shared marine and coastal resources for both the fishing sector, ecotourism, as well as biodiversity protection. Several governing bodies already exist in this region, most comprehensive is the Nairobi Convention. We will hope to build on these already existing regional collaborations, specifically focusing on how these countries can more effectively pool and utilize their financial resources.
So the environmental challenges most substantial in this region fell under 2 broad categories, industry and climate change. With respect to industry, overfishing is very substantial in the region, and the stocks of fish in the exclusive economic zones have been exploited by foreign fleets as well as artisanal fisheries, far beyond their maximum sustainable yields. Additionally, practices like dynamite fishing, purse seining, and drag netting are common in the region, which have been detrimental to ecosystems. Additionally, tourism development has had a fairly negative impact on the environment in this region. The coast has been altered by dredging and filling. There's substantial pollution due to improper disposal of waste. There's eutrophication of water due to poor sewage treatment. And there's also mining of coral and sand for construction, which degrades the reefs around the coasts.
So while most of our project is focusing on the environmental impacts of industry in the area, it's also really important to keep the climate change effects in consideration, especially things like coral bleaching, coastal erosion, and rising sea levels. It's especially important because a lot of the nations that we're studying in this area are island nations, and so all these things are going to affect them specifically more.
So for the purpose of financing a biodiversity conservation initiative in the Western Indian Ocean, we've decided to establish a conservation trust fund, which is essentially a pool of financial resources in order to mobilize and manage long-term financing of conservation initiatives, and it's similar to that of a traditional trust fund. And so we've utilized sustainable banking principles in order to mobilize such funds, which are exactly what they would sound like. These are sustainable and the integration of sustainable development and environmentally ethical values into banking frameworks and operations. And as banks Their key initiatives are to invest and to galvanize funds. We have also utilized impact investing strategies, which are investments intended to create both positive social and environmental impacts while also generating financial profit. So why should groups consider investing in the Western Indian Ocean Conservation Initiative? Well, for starters, the Western Indian Ocean is home to some of the highest rates of biodiversity and endemic species. But sadly, these rates are in rapid decline by way of extractive resource industries. That being said, the two most economically profitable industries in the area, fisheries and tourism, have extremely significant profit generating capacities and horizons if practiced both sustainably and responsibly. They have the benefit of contributing to the welfare of the communities while also generating profit for investors. And finally, because of the nature of a marine ecosystem, in its extreme interdependence, groups would see increased profit generation by investing in a regional initiative rather than just focusing efforts solely in one nation. And so this is a list of key current and potential benefactors and investors in the Western Indian Ocean. It's kind of all over the place, but the green groups are those which have already invested significant funds in conservation initiatives throughout the region. Particularly, you see on the top, the Nature Conservancy has recently invested over $22 million in a debt for a nature swap, which we'll get into later. The orange groups are those groups which have demonstrated interest both in conservation initiatives and also in the promotion of economic industries in the area, both tourism and artisanal and industrial fisheries, which are also those groups uncolored, and you can see those are particularly focused in the promotion of profit in economic industries. And finally, these blue groups here are prospective investors in benefactors. They're groups which have already have history of promoting conservation finance initiatives, but they've also, these two down here at the bottom, including the national banks, are impact investing incubators. So these just have increased potential for the conservation project.
So in addition to this Conservation Trust Fund, we also want to ensure that sustainable investment practices can be carried out long-term in the region. And for that reason, we are proposing an association of banks in the region separate from any government initiatives. So this association of banks would adhere to a shared set of environmental, social, and governance standards. And this kind of puts all banks on an even playing field so that if anyone wants to go get a loan for a future project, the same considerations will be taken no matter where they go in deciding whether or not to grant them a loan. So we drew from similar associations that are existing right now in Kenya and in Singapore. And so drawing from those, we've drafted a tentative set of standards. The first, management and reporting, calls for banks to display clear commitment to responsible banking as reflected in their operations and annual reports. Viability of materials calls for banks to conduct assessments to determine acceptability of using certain resources for any project in which they invest, with a specific focus on the ecological impact of extraction of those materials. Long-term sustainability would require banks to complete evaluations of projects' long-term sustainability and impacts to leverage against short-term financial gains to make sure they're not only taking one into consideration. Risk assessment would require banks to track and report on financial risks associated with their financing endeavors. And finally, capacity building and skills development calls for banks to set aside resources for their internal operations so that their employees can properly understand and implement the environmental, social, and governance standards.
So one major tool we plan to use, or suggest that the Conservation Trust Fund uses to raise money, is blue bonds. As you can tell by our fashion choices today, blue is a big theme of our project. And blue bonds are fairly simple if you understand how traditional bonds or war bonds function. These are structurally basically the same, except instead of contributing to the destruction of life on Earth, blue bonds and green bonds are intended to protect some life on Earth. So basically what it entails is the Conservation Trust Fund puts out a bond where investors can purchase, which will go towards, the money will go towards the endowment of the Conservation Trust Fund, as well as projects that involve the blue economy of the region, which is their economy is immediately focused on the fisheries and ecotourism, maybe involves diving. And this is projects which go towards recovering fish stocks in the region, as well as improving sustainable management of fisheries. And we suggest that the trust fund reaches out to previous investors in the area, such as the WWF, but also some major financial players, such as Citibank. But mainly, we think it's important that they also reach out for blue bonds to be purchased by what Alyssa had previously mentioned, which is the Regional Association of Banks in the region. And one other major tool we think should be used is a debt for nature swap, which basically is a country that owes a certain amount of debt to a financial institution or another nation can be forgiven a portion of that debt in exchange for funding a conservation project in their nation. So we suggest that all the countries in this region they all actually owe debt to the International Monetary Fund, which is a financial institution worldwide. And if they all agree with the International Monetary Fund to be forgiven a certain percentage of their nation's debt, then they can put that money, instead of paying back the International Monetary Fund, they can put that money towards the trust fund, which would go towards the permanent endowment of the fund, as well as specific more immediate conservation projects.
So here's a format of how the Conservation Trust Fund is going to be structured, and the flow chart is pretty much exactly what we're going for. We're looking for an integrative, transparent structure. The subsidiary bonds or bonds we have chosen down here were chosen based on the most pressing issues, as well as those sectors that happen to be the most profitable in this region. While conservation trust funds might not be a necessarily new idea to the region, it does seem that there are a lot of dispersed funds, so we would like to be the main parent fund, which will be overseen by a committee run by multinational, transnational Western Indian Ocean countries, as well as those countries that partake in tourism the most in this region. There will also be an appropriations committee, which will be responsible for responsible for meeting out how much money for each fund is necessary based on the nature of the project.
So in the fisheries sector, we hope that the Conservation Trust Fund will enhance collaboration between different sectors of this industry. A recent report by the Nairobi Convention found that over 80% of the fisheries in this region don't have an effective or have no management strategy. So the grants from the Conservation Trust Fund would first of all go towards localized small fishery management projects, such as beach management units, which are decentralized initiatives currently taking place in Kenya, Tanzania, and Mozambique, where local stakeholders will manage a fishery on their own. And then there are also regional, larger management bodies for fisheries, such as the Indian Ocean Tuna Commission and the Southwest Indian Ocean Fisheries Commission. But the grant would focus specifically on increasing the communication between these two subsets in the fisheries sector through grants for conferences that would improve collaboration between these, as well as scientific studies and management practices that take a region-based approach. In terms of marine biodiversity protection, currently only 2% of the national waters are under marine protected areas, which is short of the 10% goal that they set for themselves for 2020 under the Convention for Biological Diversity. So we hope that the grant will also improve the communication between local NGOs and large NGOs and the governments that are responsible for these marine protected areas to ensure better compliance, as well as better educational initiatives and more scientific studies that are focused on improving regional interest in ensuring that the region as a whole meets its biodiversity goals. Then in terms of enforcement, we also hope that regional enforcement can work better with local enforcement. One initiative that currently exists is the Fish Eye Africa project, which is a collaboration between Western Indian Ocean countries to share data on illegal fishing vessels via satellite, and then give that information to local enforcement at ports, so they know what fish has been illegally caught when it comes into port, and to ensure that there's a regional strategy to ensure that illegal fishing is being combated effectively.
So the following 4 recommendations work to make a shift away from business as usual tourism to ecotourism, which is defined by socially and environmentally responsible tourism practices. So first, we aim to alter consumption behaviors that take place within the resort-based and cruise-based tourist industries. According to a study on the consumption behaviors of tourists in Tanzania, Mozambique, and Seychelles, a number of aquatic species are being threatened and fished at unstable rates. For example, quote, the trade of lobsters and crabs to tourist industries, restaurants, and cruise liners, and such crustaceans are showing significant signs of depletion. We use funds for research to implement educational programs that focus on the value of MPAs and MCAs, and to implement hotel standards that work to decrease the fishing of these identified aquatic species. 2, with the recent growth of the tourism industry, responsible building practices have taken a backseat. According to a 2010 study, the dramatic boom in construction means a great demand for sand, and sand mining from the local streams that supply the beach creates imbalances in the sediment budget on the beach, which in turn produces beach erosion. Construction companies must be made aware of negative externalities in order to internalize and reflect these externalities in their bottom line. Third, we aim to increase domestic tourism. According to WI Region State Coastal Report, quote, while domestic tourism stimulates local economies and should be encouraged, it is often neglected in favor of international tourism, with coastal infrastructure often developed to favor overseas tourists. Here, we plan to use a small portion of funds to subsidize domestic tourism, thereby increase and stimulate local economies. Lastly, we aim to use funds for research to craft a set of better practices standards for the tourism industry that the construction, development companies, hotel developments, and tours should follow. These standards will reflect CSR standards and will be detailed in the following slide.
So in order to sustain and encourage better practices within the region, we recommend crafting a regional certification scheme, of which would have focus on hotel management, ecotourism, and fisheries. This could be financially supported in part by the Conservation Trust Fund. There's a number of certification organizations currently who work within the Western Indian Ocean right now, but we'd like to improve upon those organizations considering their faults. For example, the Marine Stewardship Council gets a lot of criticism for being expensive, for certifying questionable fisheries while overlooking smaller, more responsible ones. And while some of the smaller certification organizations within the Western Indian Ocean might have better reputations, they lack the benefits of being a large certification organization who has the resources and the name credibility. We recommend an alliance system for certification organizations within the region to act under. This would define their credibility and improve their effectiveness overall, of which this would have both local and global branches. The local branches could increase the inspection frequency and the thoroughness of the audits, as well as keeping in mind issues that are more relevant to a specific region. And the global branches ensure that the system is being unbiased and therefore more credible. In this alliance, we could reduce application costs to smaller businesses who can't afford these fees by being larger organizations or corporations under the alliance. We recommend that the certification systems operate by awarding a sliding grade system other than a pass-fail system, as well as ensuring that the systems become progressively stricter as time moves on and issues change, and sustainability becomes more of an attainable goal in the Western Indian Ocean green emerging market. So the first step in developing a monitoring scheme for the conservation programs in place is the establishment of baselines, which will inform the standards and goals that we discussed earlier. They're essential to the successful implementation of biodiversity programming. A baseline is a minimum or starting point used for comparison and are effective within conservation programs because they determine the area of influence, they allow for consultation with stakeholders, which includes local communities, recreational users, farmers, government, scientists, and NGOs, and it also allows for the sharing of information, including best practices. It also allows for capacity building and learning. Some things that we've kept in mind with respect to baselines is first the shifting baseline syndrome, which was developed by Dr. Daniel Pauly, and is the idea that baselines change due to different biases, and the way a system is measured changes based on how scientists perceive that environment to have once been. Additional problems include the difficulty of establishing species distribution, identification of species, and the status of endangerment, particularly within marine ecosystems, which is our particular focus. Deciding which species are most important is a difficult challenge. Additionally, projects often start before the baseline studies are completed or even conducted. Additionally, altered environments become new or skewed baseline measures, which is dangerous if you're trying to achieve a sustainable ecological program. And finally, baselines are timely and expensive to conduct, which would have to be considered during the establishment of the different conservation programs.
So in order to implement adaptive management strategies and monitoring, we recommend an integration of both local education efforts and community-based programming, in addition to the integrated scientific monitoring of projects. These efforts will be supported by the Conservation Trust Fund as well as associated research organizations and will be expected to adhere to the fund standards. A network of monitoring bodies, including local, institutional, governmental, and NGO stakeholders, will help bridge gaps between the tenets of scientific research and the process of direct project management. One organization in particular we are interested in working with is the Western Indian Ocean Marine Science Association, which is a regional nonprofit organization that is already working towards the facilitation of transnational research and local capacity building by way of different grants they provide for students receiving their MSCs or PhDs. And we would like to build off of programs such as the Marine and Coastal Science for Management program and their support for research in home country program, which they provide these grants through. The association is not itself a research institute. However, it works towards the facilitation of the local capacity building through education and research, which is what we'd like to model out off of. And then we'd also like to branch off of this, linking institutional partnerships with individual participation in order to create a more varied grouping of monitoring bodies and comprehensive data collection. Through the integration of training and empowerment of local community-based stakeholders within these existing and new programs, we hope to contribute to the national and transnational upholding of monitoring changes within this region.
In addition to comprehensive monitoring, we can understate the importance of reporting. So we recommend a combination of triple bottom line reporting and sustainability reporting alongside integrated reporting. Sustainability reporting includes the impacts not only financially but environmentally and socially. The triple bottom line reporting is very similar, except that it includes the 3 Ps and it's an accounting framework. The 3 Ps are people, profits, and planet. And integrated reporting, instead of monitoring impact, it is focused on value creation and the creation of social and environmental alongside financial capital. So within our reporting, we highlight the importance of environmental, social, and governance key performance indicators. So key performance indicators are measurable data or values that could then be used to measure how much progress a company is making in terms of its sustainability. So for example, the percent of loans that are screened for CO2. And within our integrative sustainability reporting, triple bottom line reporting, we want to frame it in a similar way to the models of the Equator Principles and the IFC performance standards. So the IFC number 1 is part of the World Bank Group, one of the 5 members of the World Bank Group. Excuse me. And they loan out money to projects in developing countries. So one of their stipulations is that when they fund a project, the organization or client has to abide by certain environmental and social principles. Based off the IFC performance standards, the Equator Principles are very similar, except that they're a voluntary measure of about 83 financial institutions, including Citigroup and Credit Suisse, in over 35 countries. And lastly, we want to create a forum that's inspired by the Madagascar Locally Managed Marine Area Network. Administrators and NGOs, as well as MPA administrators, come together to share best practices, successes and failures, and basically self-report on what they've been up to.
And according to our research, there are a number of potential challenges that we should consider and address. 1, we predict there may be resistance to changing the status quo. 2, the current lack of surveillance and enforcement in the area could pose problems with respect to continued success. And furthermore, programs like Fish Eye Africa would be integral to preserving the integrity of the project. 3, a potential challenge could be the absence of a centralized management body that can both facilitate proceedings and resolve problems when they arise. 4, related to our first challenge, an inability to reconcile social, cultural, and economic and/or environmental differences could lead to continued immobility. And lastly, and generally, of course, a lack of funding could impede the growth and quality of our program.
Anyone have any questions or comments? We'd be happy to hear them. Yeah.
So I'm just curious, you've talked a lot about ways to spend money that can be good for the environment. Who's giving this money and why are they giving it?
So that was the first, I guess, section of speakers today. And we talked about multiple, I guess, ways to get this money through, as I mentioned, green bonds and different nature swaps.
So these groups are often environmental groups such as the Nature Conservancy, World Wildlife Fund. They have a continued interest in seeing that biodiversity rates throughout the world are maintained, especially in this region where there's just like a very high concentration of, endemic species. And these groups can invest through various means of, I guess, like kind of, I'm not explaining this very well. Just through traditional investment, these would still generate profit by investing in artisanal fisheries and responsible industrial fisheries, which are kind of questionable, but also through ecotourism. These would still generate profits for investors. Particularly small private investors can still generate money through starting up like local kind of like kelp farms or something like that. So it's money that's being funneled into a trust fund through actual business transactions, but it's just that these groups are very environmentally conscious in their underlying principles. But also just for these big groups, such as the World Wildlife Fund, the World Bank, they have kind of like a reputation for corporate social responsibility. So in some kind of way, this is also increasing their consumer appeal.
Okay, so just fine. This is counting on their obligations for corporate social responsibility or their desire, their pre-existing desire to do something good? Or is it meant to bring people in by actually having good numbers economically?
Both.
Yeah.
Both for sure.
So did you look at any of that in your
Yes. So recently, green bonds, for example, in 2014, the market for that was worth like $53 billion, and it's tripled since 2011. So basically, these are growing markets that previously maybe a big bank like JP Morgan wouldn't have been interested in, but as we're seeing more and more, the value of nature being more important and more worth something, I guess, in terms of banks and in terms of dollars, then they're much more willing, I guess, to invest in these things.
And because they're sustainable in their practices, the profit horizons are extremely guaranteed in comparison to those of more short-term gain businesses that are going to maximize profit for investment in the area.
Okay, so thank you for this. It's all nice to have such a positive vision articulated. And in the last slide, you did indicate some obstacles, but there must be some very deep political barriers to doing this. And I wonder if you could just talk about one or two of those.
So we were actually warned against getting too deeply into like the issue with marine protected areas. It's not exactly something we can suggest that they set up marine protected areas, and we can certainly give suggestions and guidelines for how these governments should act, but we would rather take a more non-interventionist stance, just because, especially because a lot of the transnationality that's going on here is going to be between like France and Madagascar, who clearly have something to each other in the past. So,
And our recommendation is a lot about how it's actually financially beneficial for these countries to work together. So putting aside political differences or difficulties in that governance, we're trying to present how working together on this financial system would actually benefit each of these countries and why they should join this kind of initiative.
So my question is going to piggyback a little bit on Dale's question. So I think it's a pretty innovative approach to kind of bring together sort of the different states that have a lot to lose, frankly, right, in terms of ecosystem funding and so on. so you've leveraged a lot of key performance indicators, kind of these CSR, corporate social responsibility type indicators, and other existing frameworks that you know to exist. And I guess it would be nice to have some either contextualization of how these different tools could work within the countries, right? Because you kind of presented, here are the different tools, generally speaking, that we can leverage. It'd be nice to contextualize that within these different countries and how that might operate, and also, like, what are some specific metrics and indicators that are pertinent to the development of these countries and, you know, preventing them from experiencing the risks, you know, so you mentioned like key performance indicators, right? Like, how do you contextualize that? And also, there's some criticism amongst these metrics and indicators that they might not work the way that we think that they're supposed to work, particularly within a profit-driven setting, right? Do you have confidence based upon your work to suggest that these are going to work in such a critical context, right? In this multinational setting rather than a corporate setting, right? Completely. So, A, do you trust your indicators and metrics, and B, how do you contextualize them for this region?
Someone want to speak on it?
I can speak to the how do we contextualize them. Based on my research with tourism in the area, each one has their own set of kind of tourist activities and hotel developments. For example, the coastal areas are more active in developments, resorts, and these often lead to beach erosion. So we can kind of work with, this is really speaking to the indicator part, but we can work with each of these surrounding areas and essentially implement the social responsible standards within the tourist industry. So yeah, it doesn't really address this, but it kind of contextualizes it in that any one of these financial models can be overlaid with hotel experience, cruise experience, etc. If anyone has any research on
I guess I think the contextual part, most of these nations are already pursuing, on their own at least, some aspect of these tools or like financial instruments. And I guess what we're doing that's so innovative is really just bringing them together because they have the shared interest of, they're all sharing this marine area in the same region. So why not work together, I guess, to have a stronger benefit. And it even benefits them, I guess, because if you pool your money together, you can reach higher asset classes and financial tools. So.
We spoke quite a bit about collaboration across different vertically and horizontally dispersed stakeholders and how we can utilize different bodies in the sciences, in economic development groups, governments, NGOs, to hold all of these programs accountable and make sure that they're successful within all of the different elements that they're trying to achieve success in. And I guess not clearly in here, but in our project we did discuss collaboration and how we're going to make sure that everyone is monitoring and sticking to the indicators that we're seeking out.
Okay, we're being signaled for time, but could we get a
student question?
Yeah. Just one? Yeah, go ahead.
Can you guys speak a little bit more about your certification system and what sort of things you would be certifying?
So we were just going to focus on fisheries, hotel management, and ecotourism. And basically, so what about them would you like to know?
Oh, I just didn't know what you were certifying, but you answered it.
Yeah.
And also, yeah, we talked we had a class about certification, and we didn't like how it existed currently. And we were thinking about an interesting way to implement a certification program, particularly with an area that's economically underdeveloped. And our idea, which we discussed briefly earlier, was to have a sliding scale, so industries and corporations that could pay more would pay more to compensate for the organizations that could pay less, so that everyone would have that certification if they were seeking it out and could benefit from having an ecotourism stay on their hotel.
Thank you. President Obama has the Climate Action Plan, of which the Clean Power Plan is one of the key elements. This is promulgated by the Environmental Protection Agency, and it's going to be done by each state. The task of our capstone is to actually plan and create the New York State Clean Power Plan.
We've designed a plan for the state of New York and achieving those specific targets set by the EPA. So for the most part, as a country, we can agree on the severity of climate change, which is caused by greenhouse gas emissions. Carbon dioxide specifically poses a public health issue and an environmental issue. such as increasing occurrences of asthma, lung disease, and it also causes extreme weather conditions and storms. The Clean Power Plan seeks to mitigate some of these climate change impacts by reducing CO2 emissions from power plants specifically. Power plants account for 40% of all U.S. CO2 emissions, so that's actually the largest share of emissions. In addition, the Clean Power Plan is an executive action mandated by the EPA, and the ultimate goal is to reduce power plant CO2 emissions by 32% by 2030, and this is using a 2005 baseline. So as we can see from the graphic over here, the solid green line indicates CO2 emissions without the implementation of this plan. So we've actually been able to maintain sort of a reduction, and we would lose most of the progress that we've made if nothing's kind of done. And it would most likely increase even past 2030. And actually the Supreme Court has stayed the Clean Power Plan after 29 states sued the EPA, and a final decision should be made sometime in the fall, which it coincides with when the individual state plans are actually due. So looking more specifically into New York State, after 2030, New York will only be able to emit about 31 million short tons of CO2. This doesn't seem very significant when you're comparing it to 2012. It's only an 8% reduction. And then looking back at 2005, we have made some major progress. But it's going to be incredibly difficult in the future to reduce CO2 just because this reduction was due to mostly phasing out the high-emitting fossil fuels. And now we're mostly using natural gas. So you can see even natural gas is responsible for 82% of CO2 emissions in the state of New York. So this is just a better visual where you can see the change of electricity sources over time. So in 2005, 16% petroleum, 14% coal, very high emitting fossil fuels. By mostly phasing these out, petroleum is very slight and coal is very slight, but coal still generates a pretty good amount of CO2 emissions. This really accounts for the very steep reduction we saw in the previous slide. Hydro and nuclear have basically stayed the same. They're kind of maxed out. And really the shift or the burden of electricity production has been just shifted onto natural gas. So from 2005 to 2012, natural gas doubled. And 44% of our electricity is generated solely through natural gas, which isn't horrible just because it is the lowest emitting fossil fuel, but there's still a CO2 association. So New York is actually on track to meeting the CO2 emissions goal just because there are already plans to completely phase out that 3% of coal that we still have. What we found more of an issue was meeting the electricity needs of the state. So that we need to make up for the 55,000 gigawatt hours of electricity. And this figure includes the phase out of coal and also the expiring permits of nuclear plants in the state of New York, in addition to increased electricity consumption until 2030. We really want to just focus on replacing this energy with solar and wind. There are already some plans in the pipeline, but really it's going to be a significant ramp up of wind and solar. So 28,000 gigawatt hours of wind will be implemented in our plan and 17,000 gigawatt hours of solar. So in addition to meeting the emissions goal, we've set up these goals for our plan. So we're meeting 2030 electricity needs, as I specifically stated prior, just through renewables. So by adding the specified amounts of wind and solar, we will have electricity generation from renewables. 50% of the electricity generation will be from renewables, and that includes hydro, solar, and wind. This is particularly interesting just because Governor Cuomo also has a 50% renewable energy goal by 2030. So it's kind of a two birds with one stone situation. But of course, we realize and we acknowledge that ramping up solar and wind so significantly will be difficult, and there will need to be a lot of political will. So we plan on using natural gas as a bridge fuel from where we are now to where we want to be. And we also recommend investment in underutilized renewables such as biofuels and tidal. So we're actually going further than what the EPA mandates for
the CO2 emissions, but really that's just because by completely phasing out coal, we get rid of a good percent of our emissions.
So existing carbon-based energy sources. So as of 2012, there were 6 nuclear reactors which generated roughly 42,450 gigawatt hours in 2012. 6 coal plants in operation in 2012 as well, generating about 4,500 gigawatt hours of electricity. By 2030, assuming no license extensions or immediate directives for shutdowns, only 9 Mile Point 2 nuclear reactors slated to be in operation in New York by 2030. Under Governor Cuomo's directive, there will be no coal-powered electricity generation in 2030, effectively eliminating 5.9 million short tons of CO2 per year. According to EIA, there are roughly 300 gas power plants in New York State with about 22,000 megawatt total capacity. There are 20 plants that are greater than 30 years old that add up to 8,000 megawatts of efficiency and cooling capacity due to emissions from residual fuel oil burn. As you can see in these charts, we have the legend here, natural gas only blue, red is natural gas and distillate fuel oil, which is the lighter hydrocarbons. They're typically called oils numbers 5 and 6, or sorry, numbers 1, 2, and 4, which are lighter. Numbers 5 and 6 are the residual fuel oil, kind of as you think of it, bottom of the barrel. They emit the most soot. They're usually outlawed in New York City. They're trying to get rid of a lot of these oils because they pollute so much. Kerosene, some natural gas power plants are based on kerosene power, which is usually used for some military prop jets, some stoves, space heaters, etc. So during 2016 through 2030, these 20 natural gas and residual fuel oil plants should be retired and replaced with new efficient combined cycle gas turbine or CCGT technology or upgraded to distillate fuel oil. Okay, for 2030, the capacity of natural gas only and natural gas and distillate fuel oil plants will represent roughly 6,000 megawatts of capacity at an age of greater than 30 years old. These plants should also be upgraded or retired. Currently, there are 77 medium age, which is 10 to 30 years old, plants that are natural gas only, and 61 plants that are natural gas and distillate fuel oil. This amounts to roughly 6,000 megawatts of capacity, or about 27% gas power plant capacity in all of New York State. The biggest concern involves the old plant category, which accounts for 107 plants with 10,300 megawatt capacity. By 2030, these figures will mushroom to 205 power plants with 13,920 megawatt capacity. These power plants will have to be scheduled for retirement starting in 2030 with replacement by CCGT capacity and co-located renewable power capacity 50% each. And of course, by using this kind of generation shifting or replacing old power generation plants with newer, cleaner technologies, emissions will decline over time. New York State should select some of the larger, greater than 300 megawatt, and older, greater than 30-year-old natural gas plants to be co-located with 50% of power capacity from wind and solar. Through this type of development, New York State can eventually successfully shift to carbon-free power generation post-2030. Here we have the Cricket Valley Energy Center, and it is the only natural gas power plant in the pipeline for New York State. A few key details. It's a 1,000 megawatt power plant. 800 jobs will be created during construction, and 30 jobs will be created specifically for power plant operation. It will provide electricity to almost 1 million homes, and the estimated gas power plant should start between 2018 and 2019 with construction slated for mid-2016. Okay, so 2016 to 2030, more power from existing natural gas plants. What can really New York State do? What can we focus on? So the first part would be efficiency. Increase efficiency and upgrade the older gas power plants to have a lower heat factor, which is less energy input and power output. 2, capacity utilization. Increase capacity utilization of the more efficient CCGT gas power plants from 44% to roughly 55%, with more baseload service and peak service. Retirement. Retire by 2020 all remaining old coal power plants, which is already slated and mandated by Cuomo, for a total of about 1,000 megawatts, and they're all over 35 years old. And also retire by 2020 Indian Point nuclear power plant. Consider replacing the capacity at Indian Point brownfield with roughly, as I mentioned before, 50% gas and 50% renewable solar and wind power generation. Reduction. Reduce by 2030 the capacity of oil-only power plants and convert all dual-fuel gas power plants from residual fuel oil to distillate fuel oil, and the capacity of gas storage and gas pipeline delivery, and increase natural gas power percent share to offset the decline in power from retired old coal, oil, and nuclear power plants. And then additionally, the last one should be retraining local workers in renewable power generation and power transmission before shutting down their coal and oil-only power plants to offset potential job losses. Of course, the other kind of scenario that we're looking at is if gas continues as a supplement and backup to solar wind power, New York State really needs to look way into efficient CCGT gas power plants with co-location of renewables, more underground storage capacity, especially from natural gas hotspots such as Ohio and Pennsylvania, the largest shale basins in this country, and more gas pipeline capacity for deliveries to New York high peak demand areas for gas power and heat.
So now that we've talked about where electricity production in New York State is, we want to talk about where it's going, and that is hopefully into renewable energy. So wind and solar both represent our greatest potential for growth in the state. In 2014, 3% of our state's electricity production was from wind power. This map shows both existing wind projects and projects in the pipeline, which comes to about 11,000 gigawatt hours of electricity. So to meet our goal, we have to find the space for an additional 28,000 gigawatt hours. So with wind, we're generally talking about either on or offshore. Offshore, New York State has a lot of access to water, and you can install larger, more efficient turbines. So we want to install 98,000 gigawatt hours of electricity offshore, and then turbines on land may not be as an attractive an option, but it can be installed in spaces that can still be used for other purposes. So we're proposing 9,000 gigawatt hours on land. So on land, these maps show, the first one shows the wind speeds in New York. So the darkest blue is the highest wind speed, therefore the best locations for wind energy. And then the second map shows current land use in New York. And I want to point out the yellow areas because that's agricultural land. So we can't say, okay, wipe out agricultural farms and put in wind farms, but 29,000 square kilometers of that land is open pasture. So by installing wind turbines on pasture land, you're not taking away from the original use of that space. And in that 29,000 square kilometers, we calculated that you could generate 40,000 gigawatt hours of electricity. That's by using 3 megawatt turbines, which are the only ones that are currently suitable for use on land. And to get our 9,000 gigawatt hours for total on-land turbines, we would need 500 to 1,000 square kilometers. So there's more than enough space in open pasture alone. However, there is a lot of potential offshore. So around Long Island, where a lot of New York's coastline is, a lot of the potential for wind energy is already being tapped by existing projects. So we looked over on the other side to the Great Lakes. There was a study done in the Great Lakes for potential for wind energy. So the dotted line here shows what portion of each lake is owned by New York, and then the pink areas are where you could install wind turbines. So that on Lake Ontario and Lake Erie, there are 2,500 square kilometers of space suitable for turbines. So to create our 19,000 gigawatt hours projected electricity, use a combination of 257 megawatt turbines and 1,300 5 megawatt turbines. So offshore, you can use larger turbines that are more efficient. This would take up 900 to 1,800 square kilometers, depending on the spacing. So there is more than enough space on the Great Lakes to install the 1,900 gigawatt hours that we're aiming for. So solar is the other area that we can greatly improve upon in New York State. First, I want to mention that in our state, we're looking for PV panels, not concentrated solar, which is best suited for areas, a lot of open land and a lot of heat. So we just don't have a lot of potential for that in New York. There are currently 1,400 gigawatt hours either in the active projects or projects in the pipeline. We propose to add 17,000 gigawatt hours in solar power. So we broke this up into small and large scale projects. Small scale is mostly rooftop projects. So we are aiming to add 2,500 gigawatt hours in solar panels on rooftops. And then the other area is large scale solar farms, which represent an easier way to create more electricity with one project. So our goal was for 14,500 gigawatt hours on these large projects. As far as feasibility of actually installing solar, so our first diagram shows solar radiation in the state, where darker red is more solar radiation, therefore better for solar panels. And then the second one shows existing infrastructure, so that includes existing plants, existing infrastructure, as well as solar installers. So both the concentration of radiation and infrastructure are in New York City, up in the Hudson Valley. And since 50% of the state's total electricity use comes from the New York City metropolitan area, solar is actually a great fit for a state. So there are existing large-scale solar projects in New York. So first we looked at the Long Island Solar Farm. It's the 32 megawatt project. And again, these solar farms are great because one project is producing so much energy rather than scattering it on rooftops. It is hard to find just open land to put these on, so we want to repurpose brownfields. Also, private investors can use lands. There's also new technology that there's a company that makes floating solar panels. So on a state like New York, where there is open water, but maybe not that much open land, you can actually create a solar farm on water. Another sort of multi-use space option is in solar parking canopies. So this is another project in Long Island. This is a 17 megawatt project over various parking lots. Unlike when people might complain about the look of solar panels on their homes, parking lot is already ugly, and you're getting shade for your cars on hot days. And this is something that can be done not only with businesses, but there are government-owned lots along our highway systems. There are rest stops, there are park and ride lots, we have state parks, and even government offices. So rooftops, we broke into commercial and residential. These may not produce the same amount of electricity, and there are high upfront costs, but it is a choice that homeowners and businesses can make. There are subsidies and tax credits in place to help people install these projects, and over time they will pay themselves off. For businesses especially, this is an attractive option because they may have large warehouses or stores, which is a good space to put them. And it's attractive for business because people are becoming more and more aware of where their money is going, and they want to invest in companies that are doing green things. So New York City alone is a great spot for rooftop solar because we have so many buildings. A study was done by CUNY that found that 2/3 of the rooftops in New York City are suitable for solar panels, which comes to a potential 8,700 gigawatts of electricity. So if our goal for rooftop solar is 2,500 gigawatt hours, that could be achieved in New York City alone. So solar and wind have the greatest potential for growth in our state, but they can't produce electricity 24/7. For storage, existing battery power isn't efficient or accessible enough. So we also wanted to talk about other forms of renewable energy. So these are both forms that are currently being used in New York State. As we said, a lot of our power comes from hydroelectric plants. Very little can be done there except in the form of retrofitting dams that already exist to produce electricity. Though there is a lot of hydrokinetic potential, which includes tidal power. So there's a current successful project in New York City in the East River producing electricity from tidal turbines, which is 24/7, it's predictable, there's a low environmental impact, and is so reliable that it stayed operational through Hurricane Sandy. Biofuel is also currently in New York used in the form of burning landfill gas, but there's a project in the works in Long Island for an anaerobic digestion plant, which has benefits of electricity production, fuel, and waste management. So with both of these technologies, there may not be the same potential for growth and expansion as solar or wind, but they're 24/7 sources of power that are important for any clean energy plan, and innovation in both of these are happening right here in New York.
So now we have explained how much energy we need, why we need it, and where we want to get it from. There are 4 different policies that are actually going to get us there it's very, very real that this is happening. So the first one of them is RGGI. It stands for Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. It has been going on since 2008, and it's a carbon trade system for CO2 emissions that is in 9 states in the Northeast and Mid-Atlantic region. What happened, it was that in 2005, they set the goal that they wanted to plateau the emissions by 2009 levels. And the good thing was that New York State did so well that we actually decreased our emissions by a lot more than we needed. So in 2014, the cap had to be reset and lowered by 45%. And ever since, we're decreasing 2.5% per year. This way, this program, this initiative has proven to be very effective to have the market help us reduce our emissions. And the plan is that it's going to keep going at least until 2020 and perhaps even longer depending on how it goes. The second one is LEED. I bet many of you have already heard about it. It's called Leadership in Energy and Environmental Design. It is a standard that is given to buildings for both commercial and residential. It's a global standard. It's the best, one of the most effective environmental third-party certification, and they give you certain rating levels depending on the efficiency and how green a building is. So New York State has placed a lot of emphasis on having these in all the state buildings. The next one are the tax investment credits and the production tax credits. The investment tax credits is exclusively for solar power, both in residential and commercial like the other ones. That is at 30% federal tax. This is not only from New York State, this is something that's happening in the entire country. Initially it was supposed to go only until 2019, but in 2015 it was reformed and now it's going to go until 2023. Again, it's relying more or less on the market. The other tax credit is a production tax credit that is for wind, hydro, biomass. That for every kilowatt hour that is produced, a certain amount of tax credit is given. And the way it works is that right now there's a certain amount that is given for every kilowatt hour, and that amount is going to be decreasing every year. That way they're encouraging the market to start producing wind and start. Part that Reforming Energy Vision includes is community engagement, and that is being done through grants and support and to have the community eventually further political will. So after Cuomo's gone, we can just keep going. So for our closing remarks, these are our final recommendations. We are consistent with the policies and all the numbers we crunched. The first one is to phase out nuclear and coal. We're already there with coal. We're going to get rid of coal. The second one is to use natural gas as a bridge, because although it does emit CO2, it emits way less, and it's cleaner in general. We're also going to clearly expand on sun and wind, increase the energy efficiency, which is also part of the clean power plan, and we really believe that efficiency is a great way to go, because we were not only really challenged by lowering the emissions, as Jessica mentioned, but by how much power we're actually going to need. So if we increase efficiency, that means that we would get there easier. We also want to put the permanent, like the taxes that I talked about, we want them to be permanent and not only until 2019 and 2023. We want to continue with market engagement because it has proven to be a very useful tool because now it's great that communities are engaged and we're also going to foster that in political action, but sometimes it's not enough and the market can help us get there. Thank you.
One more slide.
Oh. That's all right. I forgot. So, any questions?
So in the future, you'll be utilizing a lot of different types of renewable energy. So how do you plan to distribute that energy? Like, is it all going into the same grid? And then how do you distribute it from there?
So I think we talked about investments into like better grid technology. Being connected to the grid is important now and in the near future because these renewables aren't, it's the same issue that renewables can't produce energy 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. So we need that connection to the grid to use electricity. Throughout the night, you're not using the electricity from your solar panels on your house, but you're using the electricity from the natural gas plants that are still operating.
The transmission lines are going to be important for energy efficiency or transporting that energy efficiently. But that's not necessarily part of the Clean Power Plan. I mean, that's definitely something that needs to be taken into consideration with, such distributed energy sources like wind and solar. And there are already things that are happening. So there's already new transmission lines that are being built, especially around the lower Hudson Valley area, just because the lower part of New York actually uses a lot more electricity than the north part, and most of it is produced in the north.
I think we could also capitalize though on existing infrastructure, and we think that those ideas are all great. That's also why, especially in the natural gas part of this presentation at least, co-location is super important. This thing is, especially with permitting, is a big problem. It's a huge problem because there's not a regulatory committee such as FERC, which does all the natural gas pipelines, has federal jurisdiction, isn't really regarded under any kind of state's rules or state's rights, et cetera. You just put pipelines through different states through your home kind of directly. That was one problem. The second problem though too is with co-location, or at least it's a benefit with co-location, you can use the existing power transmission lines of the natural gas power plant, so you don't have to worry necessarily about creating this new infrastructure, putting more money into transmitting electricity, losing electricity because you're using alternating current instead of direct current, et cetera. So it ends up being a little more efficient, at least in our opinion, to co-locate the renewables with the existing power source until we can be fully reliant on renewables.
I guess this is a follow-up to that question. Given the sort of significant capital investments that would have to be made eventually to distribute renewables, why wouldn't, it seems to me that small-scale solar is a really useful interim measure, and it's something that you sort of downplayed. I mean, if you can generate actually 8,000 megawatts or whatever you said, 3 or 4 times easily what your target was, why wouldn't you do that instead?
I think our issue with small-scale solar projects was that's something where we're kind of trying to come up with such a big plan for the entire state, relying on individual homeowners to install their own solar panels is asking a lot, and there's no way to really force people to install solar in these small-scale settings. So while that is, it would be great if everyone would put solar panels on their home, but what we struggled with was the tools to getting people to actually do that.
I also forget the exact percentage, but I think the smallest percentage of solar is actually residential solar, if I'm not mistaken.
And within Reggie, right now, just from Reggie since 2008, we've had 929 million revenue, and some of that is being used, redirected towards communities to help them establish their own solar programs. And it's also going towards lowering the cost of solar, so we cannot completely anticipate whether people are going to install them at the rate that we need them to be installed.
If it's all right. So you presented one portfolio, 9,000 and 19,000. The only way that we can make sense of that is by comparison with other portfolios, using a dimension like cost or reliability or something like that. How did that fit into your project, comparing what you came up with against other possible ideas?
Well, so our numbers as far as like breaking up where like the energy is actually coming from, if I understand correctly, was based on an existing project that was done. So it's a project called 100% New York, I believe, which came from a study that Stanford did saying, like, okay, if we're trying to go for 100% renewable energy, like, how do we actually get there? So we use their numbers as sort of a guideline to see where we can actually, put this, and it's a certain amount of speculation as far as how all of these projects will add up. Yeah.
If most of the power you need is downstate, why did you focus your offshore wind in the Great Lakes instead of like in Long Island Sound or?
That's because it's already being developed there. So there's already wind projects that are being done in Long Island. So a lot of the potential is already being used up. And that wind farm goes into our numbers on what's like in the pipeline. So we wanted to look to the Great Lakes where there aren't projects being done.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So unfortunately, our mentor, Miriam, wasn't able to make it because of a professional emergency. But that's okay, because we're here. So our Capstone, Social Resiliency in Coastal Cities, asks and tries to answer three fundamental questions. What is resiliency? What does it look like on the ground? And most importantly, what is the role of community, social networks, in other words, people? We spent most of the semester investigating public life in public spaces in New York City in order to ask the question, how do we create a people-centered resilience approach? So without further ado.
All right, so great. Hi everyone, my name is Raymond.
I'm Tessa.
And I'm Gina.
And along with the rest of our group, we are part of the Social Resilience in Coastal Cities Capstone. So here's a, that thing not there.
Looks like you're put down to the east.
Yeah, let's go down to
All right, so here's a quick breakdown of what we're going to be going through today. We're going to start with a broader approach, and as we go through our literature research, we'll take you through New York City, our observation sites, and finally Hunts Point, which is the site of our case study. So our clients for this capstone is Habitat 3. Habitat 3 is a UN summit that gathers every 20 years to discuss and develop plans for sustainable human settlements. they tasked us with developing a case study for the Rebuild by Design Lifelines project located in Hunts Point. Rebuild by Design is a federally organized project that is a partnership between the U.S. Department of Habitat and Housing and Urban Development, as well as the Rockefeller Foundation. So our end goal is to create a set of recommendations for the Rebuild by Design project that is centered around the people. So the reason why projects such as Rebuild by Design exist is because of in response to climate change. Climate change is causing the rise in sea levels as well as an increase in extreme events. And with the increase in coastal urban populations we're seeing that is projected to rise into the future, we will be seeing greater climate risk.
So how do we deal with this climate risk? We think that governments at all levels need to address climate risk design resilience as the ability to prepare, respond, and adapt to extreme disruptions and long-term stressors. An extreme disruption is something like a storm event, and a long-term stressor could be something like sea level rise. We chose those three verbs because it covers the temporal scale of resilience planning, and that's before an event, during an event, and after an event. Specifically in New York City, what is New York doing planning-wise? And New York has 520 miles of coastline. It borders oceans, rivers, bays, inlets, and is both diverse and complex in ecology and also in community. Many of these coastal communities in New York lie within the 100-year flood zone, and with the vulnerability of these coastal communities exposed during Sandy, New York City's planning underwent a major turning point. Plans such as Build It Back, One by Sea, formerly Plan by Sea, and Rebuild by Design, our focus, came into effect. And these projects all have components that can be broken down into three different categories shown up on the screen. The first is protection, and this entails keeping the water out. The second is adaptation, and this entails living with the changes. And the third is retreat, and this entails moving away from the hazard or the risk.
So although New York City and resilience planning in general have all these great infrastructural strategies to adapting and overall building resilience in coastal areas, we found that there are a lot of gaps in these sorts of approaches. For example, a lot of infrastructural development has a finite lifespan. So that means that it's a question of not if it fails, but when it fails, regardless of whatever maintenance you're able to do on a project. Eventually it will inevitably fail. Additionally, many of these infrastructural approaches are focused on solely one climate hazard at once, whereas there are other options that address multiple hazards at the same time. Finally, many infrastructural approaches do not address social inequalities. There are social vulnerabilities that are expounded by climate change, and oftentimes many of these structural installments even worsen some of the social issues in the area by the selective process by which these projects are located. So, in order to fill some of these gaps that we found in current resilience planning, our literature research focused on how to integrate social resources and social relationships into resilience planning. It allowed us to investigate different elements of social interactions and social networks that allow for more lasting and flexible communities. We determined that investing in these elements of social and community strength offers an opportunity to expand ideas of resilience for ways that would be more productive in fighting climate change effects. As we mentioned, many of these types of socially focused strategies already exist in New York City's plans and plans globally. However, we argue that there should be a greater focus on this kind of approach.
So within our literature research, we broke it down into two components, as Tessa said, and the first one is social infrastructure. And social infrastructure can then further be broken down into two pieces. So the first is built spaces over here, and these are gathering spaces for the community. They include things like schoolyards, plazas, and parks are something that we focus on later in our public life studies, which we'll get to. The second component is the human-driven networks, and these are things that need people to function. So things like emergency response networks, educational networks, and having a community leader as a point of reference. If we have successful built spaces and successful human-driven networks, we can then have
a community with access to resources and information. This is especially key during emergency response, and also active networks, which means constant contact and communication within the community. If these things are all working properly, we can then maybe have our next slide, which we're going to talk about.
Great, so working in tandem with social infrastructure is social interactions, which is the second key part of the resilience puzzle. So based on our research, several things have come up again and again to have proven to be really the backbone of a stronger community. And these things include things such as trust, these social networks, and resident participation. So all these are highly interconnected with one another. So you can kind of think of community like a rubber band, where the multiple fibers of social links is what holds it together. And the disturbance is essentially stretching this quote-unquote rubber band. And the strength of those social links is what determines how well the community can come back together and regain that shape. So as alluded to, the stronger community will lead to a stronger and more coherent response to an emergency.
So in order to see how some of these social interactions and social links are forming in real life, we conducted our own public life studies using Jan Gehl's public life study methodology, which is more or less a systematic way of understanding how social behavior happens in public space. We conducted over 180 hours of site visits across 14 different locations as a class. You can see 4 of the locations up there in green, which are all in Hunts Point in the Bronx, which we wanted to focus on because that was the Regal by Design proposal's location. So we wanted to see how public life was taking place there already. But we also wanted to look at the other 10 locations across New York City to provide a baseline for how public life might be happening differently in different areas and what we can learn from those different spaces. So in our studies, we could ask 2 major questions: who's visiting the parks and how are they using the space? So in general, public life can be broken down into these 2 areas: how people interact with the spaces themselves and how people interact with each other. So down here are pretty simple examples of how people might go about doing it. And we use these sorts of examples to conduct our own studies to figure out what activities people are doing in those parks. So this is some of our research that we found by doing our public life studies. You can see that there are some major activities that were common across all the spaces regardless of how they were set up. Particularly sitting down in the light blue is a favorite activity. Also interacting with the waterfront when there was a waterfront in the space, as well as different ways of moving through the space. So biking, walking your dog, etc. And these kinds of activities are important not just because we want to know what's going on in the space, but also because they're ways to foster community interaction and connection with the space itself. So for example, walking your dog down the street is a great way to interact with other people because everyone loves petting dogs, but you need to talk to the owner first, right? So that's a great example of how interactions can be fostered by these types of activities.
So where does public life occur? And it's within public space. And public space can be broken down into 3 parts. The first is built infrastructure, and that includes things like seating, which, as Tessa said, is needed for all the sitting that's occurring within the park. And this also means a variety of seating, so not just benches and chairs, but having lawn space to sit. The second piece is the people-driven infrastructure, because you can't have a public space without the public, so you need the people there. And this includes not only the pedestrians and the community members coming through, but also the people who work in the space. So maintenance workers, maybe people selling food in the space. And then the third factor is something outside of the urban planner's choices and outside of the community members. It's things that we can't control. So it's weather, time of day, season, so on. And then back to our research, our site visit research. There's 2 examples from places that we visited on our site visits. The first one is Julio Carballo Fields in the Hunts Point in the Bronx. The second is Bush Terminal Pierce Park and Sunset Park in Brooklyn. And both of them have seating, pathways, recreational fields, and water runs and bins. The pathways are important because they create borders and have a designated use. You walk on a pathway. The recreational fields are important as attractors. They attract formal things like soccer games between 2 teams, but also informal events like going with your friends to the park to kick a ball around. And then water fountains and bins address public need, with human need within the public sphere. These last two, waterfront access and bike paths, occur specifically in Bush Terminal Pierce Park, and we address them because, as Tessa said earlier, waterfront access is a huge attraction to the space, and people come to take photographs, they come to observe fish, and so on. And then bike paths creates a diversity in use of the space. So now you don't just have to walk, you can come ride your bike, you can skateboard, so on. Kind of this next slide highlights an example of, for us, how public life and public space sort of came together. And one of our members, Rachel, was doing site visits on Maria Hernandez Park in Bushwick, and Bushwick has a high concentration of Ecuadorian American residents. And after the earthquake last month, they wanted to commemorate the victims and have a vigil. And through word of mouth organization and community leader organization, they were able to gather in Maria Hernandez Park because they felt safe there and comfortable there, and they had a space in order to show their identity and solidarity.
Alright, so with this understanding of public life and public space, we want to now turn our attention to Hunts Point, which is the location for the Rebuild by Design project. But before we go into the details of the Rebuild by Design project, we want to first become familiar with Hunts Point as a region. Now, Hunts Point is important as a food distribution center. It is a critical regional asset serving 22 million people in the greater New York City area. 2/3 of New York City's produce does come through Hunts Point. However, Hunts Point is not indestructible. Its location along the waterfronts puts it at risk to those rising sea levels and extreme events we mentioned earlier, as well as its location within a 100-year flood zone. This is the reason why projects such as Rebuild by Design do focus on protecting the food hub. But Hunts Point is also not just a food hub, it also has a residential core, albeit one that is quite isolated from the food hub itself, as well as the greater New York City area and its nearby neighborhoods. Within this residential core, we have 48,000 residents, 45% of which live below the poverty line, 2/3 of which do not speak English as their primary language, and 38% of which are dependents, meaning that they are under the age of 18 or over the age of 65. Now, these demographics are very important in shaping the way we approach Hunts Point. It shaped our recommendations because we wanted to make sure that public space took all of these factors into account.
So in making our recommendations, we had to look back at what the Rebuild by Design proposal already includes. So the Lifelines proposal is made up of a few major elements, and 4 of them are listed here. The first is the Flood Protection Levee Lab, building up resilience technologies that can be implemented globally or locally. The second is a focus on economic growth. So the proposal was focused on creating employment opportunities for Hunts Point residents, particularly in relation to the food distribution center. The third element was infrastructural investments, namely the maritime emergency supply lines, which would supply energy and transport connectivity in times of need to Hunts Point. And finally, building sustainable connections. So they wanted to create a bike path that goes from the Bronx River Greenway to Hunts Point, as well as diverting certain truck routes around the area to make it a little more safe and a little bit greener in terms of transport. And while in parallel to our previous discussion, although a lot of these developments and proposals are focused on increasing resilience of the region, as well as a more physical focus in many cases, we argue that the proposal could really benefit from what we've learned in terms of social resilience and public life studies. So we've made 5 recommendations that are able to support that approach to resilience, and we're going to go through each of them in turn, but they're listed up here for you. I'll give you a second to read them. But we'll go through each. So the first one is the Lifelines Groundskeepers organization. So although the Lifelines proposal used a lot of community input in the planning and development stages of the proposal, there was a lack of continued community involvement beyond implementation of the project. So what we propose is building this organization of community members who would serve as a community advisory board and management group. So their responsibilities would include developing community events and engagement programs, facilitating park board meetings and volunteer efforts, and other initiatives focused on involving the community on an ongoing basis beyond implementation of the plan. So these individuals who are hired to be groundskeepers would themselves have a sense of ownership in the space, and additionally provide an anchor for the rest of the community to come, connect with people they know, and build those stronger social interactions that are so important.
All right, now we have emphasized a lot about how public space can be used to promote public life, and how public life can in turn increase community interactions. However, public space is only useful in as much as people are willing to come in and engage with and utilize the space. So our recommendations focus on bringing more people into existing public park spaces. And in doing so, they also want to attract different groups into the space. Success in doing so will allow that space to become an anchor in the community, which will then increase communal interactions. So in terms of concrete recommendations, we suggest setting a precedent for the use of space as a gathering space. So this can include increasing events, programs, or even community picnics, for example. But however, we also want to make sure that those events are inclusive to have multiple groups into that area. So we do not only have interaction within groups, we also have it between groups. And lastly, we want to emphasize the importance of community values. So during one of our site visits to Riverside Park, we ran into an individual who told us about the popular use of barbecues in the park. Now this is not only an excellent community builder, it's also community driven. So having insights into the community such as that is essential when trying to make recommendations and constructing for a community where you're building upon something that already exists. As the barbecue example does, it does suggest food is something that brings people together, whether it is eating it or making it. However, Hunts Point's residents are limited in their access to quality foods, as evidenced by our observations of very few grocery stores within that area. Now, while Rebuild by Design does propose a food market, we also suggest other means to tackle this. This includes community-supported agriculture pickup programs, as well as food co-ops. What both of these do is that they bring fresh foods into community centers, such as churches or schools, and in doing so, they not only increase access of these foods to the residents, but they also serve as a center for people to meet, talk, and exchange ideas. We also want to suggest a Food Truck Saturdays program. The goal of this is that we acknowledge that restaurants and food centers already exist within that area. So the goal of that is to make residents aware of what's already available to them. The benefits of such a program is that residents can build upon these connections even when the program isn't running.
So our fourth recommendation builds as another programming on the space to attract members to the proposed Lifelines project. And the Lifelines project already proposes this Levee Lab, which is a research-based facility focused on coastal protection. And we suggest that they should also implement educational and outreach programs on the Levee Lab. So when the Levee Lab also becomes an attractor to the community, that attracts all different types of people, including children, teens, moms with kids, couples with kids, and these groups can find a support network and meet other people like them. As well, if people use the space multiple times, there often is a sense of ownership over the space, and like Tessa mentioned in the first recommendation about having a groundskeeper, you want the community to have a sense of ownership of the space and feel connected to the space. As well, there are already a fair amount of educational nonprofits working within the Hunts Point area, and they can be used as a resource to develop waterfront curriculums. And our final recommendation is essentially bringing the residential core, which, as we saw on the first slide, is over here, to the waterfront where Lifelines project will exist. It's about a 20-minute walk as it is, so there needs to be an improved transportation option there. From what we observed on our site visits, Hunts Point does not have very good transport. The subways are lacking and the sidewalks are not well